We're looking at the first two chapters of Melachim, Book of Kings, and essentially the end of the Book of Shmuel. The Book of Shmuel has two different endings. The first ending, which is what we call the end of Shmuel, chapter 24, that's an ending which speaks to the question of kingship and ends with the kind of ideal picture of kingship. The king is the one who understands the king's role as the Torah described it, and as the book of Shmuel understands it, the dual role of the king is to be in God's service and try to enact God's aspirations for our world. And those aspirations are set out in the very beginning of the book in Hannah's prayer after she gives birth. She talks about the world that she envisions, not the world in which she lives in, but the world in which she envisions, where it's a just, fair place, where people are not taken advantage of, not marginalized, where the wicked, the haughty, the arrogant are put in place. And she ends this description of this world that she imagines with this verse, V'yitein oz l'malko v'yarem keren mishicho, God should give strength to God's king. Now at that point, there is no king. But in that prayer, and perhaps the prayer is a text written for something else, it's actually irrelevant. But the book of Shmuel incorporates that prayer into the beginning of the book, and what she's praying for, it's called a tefillah. She's praying for someone who understands that the role of the leader is to put in place this vision of the world. That's how the book begins. And the book ends, the first ending, the end of Shmuel, chapter 24, it ends with a picture of King David, who understands what the king's role is. Firstly, the king is there to serve God. In the words of the Torah, Sheyivchar Hashem Elohecha bo. And secondly, the king is there to serve the people. And in chapter 24, David understands both of those, the dual understanding of kingship, the ideal understanding of kingship, and actually he's willing to step aside. First he says to God, you choose the appropriate punishment for me. I have acted as if they're my people, and they're not my people, they're your people. I just serve you, so you choose the punishment, not I. And then when David sees the people suffering, David says, if my being king causes people to suffer, I'll step aside, let your hand be against me in my dynasty. I'm willing to accept my the need to remove me, get someone who better serves the people. At which point God says to David through the prophet, I see you understand the kingship. Now go and bring a sacrifice in the threshing place of Aravna, Mr. Ark, the Aron. Now the Aron can find its permanent place in the city and you can be in my city because you understand what it means to be king. David does this, he brings the sacrifice, and the plague is stopped. The plague is stayed, and that's the end of Shmuel as we know it, and it's a completely appropriate ending. It's not something which is simply added an add-on. It's a quite appropriate ending. That's the first ending. That's the first ending of the book, and as we discussed, the book of Shmuel employs two consecutive stories from the book of Breshit to tell its own story. And the two stories it employs are the story of the Akedah and the purchase of the gravesite for Sarah, Marat HaMachpelah. And I would add that it doesn't just employ two stories which are sort of secondary stories. These are two central stories which are part of the conclusion of the whole Abraham narrative. And that furthermore, the Abraham narrative is chosen for a reason. That's not arbitrary either, because the story of Abraham in the Chumash is the story about passing on from one generation to the next, the patriarchal blessing, which is in fact the story of kingship. In fact, at the end of Shmuel, David has a promise of kingship, but we don't know who the successor will be. Unlike the Akedah, we know it's Yitzchak. But in the book of Shmuel, we don't know who the successor is. And we talked about that last week, that the successor is not named in this ideal picture. I suggested that the best successor is not around. The one who might have succeeded, which is Avshalom, he's out. Avshalom might have succeeded. He starts off very positively, but due to his own failings, and I think primarily to David's failings, Avshalom will not succeed. Avshalom is caught in the bush. He's nechaz basvach. There's no substitute for it. So at the end of the book of Shmuel, we know that David will have kingship. We don't know yet how. And now we come to the second ending of the book, which is actually found in the first two chapters of Melachim, and that is about the implementation. How, in fact, do we set up the kingship? Now, in the case of Abraham, that story begins how Avram sets up the patriarchal continuity. What Avram has to do is to find a replacement for Sarah. He's come to understand that Sarah was his partner in destiny, and he understands that without Sarah, there is no future. And now he sees his son Yitzchak, his son who was covenantal, but he understands Yitzchak needs a covenantal partner who will help him, who will guide him. And that's the story of chapter 24, the longest chapter in Breshit, which begins Avraham Zaken Ba Bayamim, Vashem Berachet Avraham Bakol. And now we come to our next chapter, which is the third consecutive story of the Abraham narrative is behind it. And it begins, Hamelch David Zaken Ba Bayamim, King David was old. And this story will be about how you actually set up the kingship. We know there's a promise. We know David understands perfectly the kingship in the last story. That's the ideal of kingship. Same with the Akedah is the ideal of Abraham, the way the covenantal patriarchal blessing will continue, will be through Yitzchak. Abraham has passed this test. Abraham has been willing to step aside, which guarantees him that he doesn't have to step aside. He accepts his own fate, just as David did. And that's part of coming to an understanding of your humanity is what allows you to move forward. All that is true. And now the question is, in terms of kingship, the third consecutive story in the Abraham narrative, Abraham Zaken Bayamim, Abraham sends his servant, the story of Rivka, the negotiations, that's what will lie behind the story of chapter 1 and 2 of Kings, which is the second ending to the book of Shmuel. Because at the end of chapter 2, David's kingship will be established. It's not established till you have a successor. And the successor will be named in these two chapters, and the successor will assume his place as king in these two chapters. So that's the parallel between the two. But there is an important difference as we're about to study these two chapters, and the difference is that the story of Abraham, the patriarchal narrative, the passing on of the patriarchal covenantal blessing, that's a very beautiful story, a story in which Abraham is fully involved. He gives instructions to his servant. The servant will pray to the God of Abraham, and one gets a sense, even though he's old, that he's fully involved and in charge from beginning to end. The story of kingship is very different. Kingship is not the same as the patriarchal blessing. Kingship, as we have seen in the book of Shmuel, for those who studied it, kingship has a very problematic side to it. The prophet Shmuel was opposed to kingship. It lends itself to all kinds of terrible misbehaviors. It lends itself to the search for power. It lends itself to all kinds of deal making. It lends itself to forgetting how you got where you got. It lends itself to causes you to not see, to not be able to judge fairly, et cetera, et cetera. It's very political in that sense, in the negative side. And the book, so therefore we shouldn't expect that the story of this, how we implement kingship, will be as beautiful and as clean as the Abraham story. And we already started last week, and we saw that the very first verse suggests that these two stories are not the same in the sense they're parallel, but not identical at all, because the very first verse says that they covered him with clothing. So you get a picture of somebody who is cold. He's old. He's also very cold. And the clothing, of course, represents the kingship in the book of Shmuel. So the kingship is not yet established. Of course, till you have a successor, there's no kingship. There may be a king, but there's no kingship. And then we have the servants, Vayom Lo Avadav in Pasuk Bet, Yivakshu Adoni HaMelech Na'ara Betula, V'yamda Lifnei HaMelech Utilo Sochenet, V'shachva B'chekecha V'cham L'Adoni HaMelech, the servants of the king, suggest that he's very cold. Let's bring a young woman who will stand before the king and wait upon him, and Yashva B'chekecha, lie in his bosom and warm him up. So her function will be to keep the king warm. And they search around all of Israel to find the most beautiful woman, and they find this Avishag Ashunamit. They bring her to the king, and verse number 4, very beautiful. And she stood and she served the king. She waited upon the king. The king knew her, literally knew her not. And that is a very important expression, phrase, word in our story. The king knew her not. Now, knew or not, knew can have a sexual meaning. Maybe that's its primary meaning, and that's important. She just serves him. She waits upon him. She serves him, keeps him warm or whatever. But Hamelech Lo Yida'ah could have a second meaning as well, which is he doesn't know her. And this raises the question throughout, what does the king actually know? How much does he know? Does he know what's going on altogether? We know Abraham knows very well what's going on. Does David know what's going on? Okay. I wanted to repeat now, as we're going to continue now. If anybody has something to say, just unmute yourself, raise your hand, call upon you. And I'm going to be pausing at some point as well in the future, and just to give everybody an opportunity to speak up so we can make this as interactive as possible. But in any event, if someone wants to comment, just raise your hand, unmute, and speak up. Okay. Now, okay. So, I mean, some of you have, I can't see your picture, so I don't know if you're raising your hand or not, but some faces I see, and there are many faces I don't see. Now we'll continue with our story. Now, it's interesting to note, by the way, and we'll see this, that these two chapters of Melachim, they're in the book of Kings. Why are they in the book of Kings altogether? Apparently, our tradition wanted to place this story in Sefer Melachim. The story has many negative pieces to it, and perhaps it's more appropriate to end Shmuel on the high note and to put into the book of Melachim, the book of Kings, which is the book of exile. Sefer Melachim is about how do we get into this mess in the first place? That's what Sefer Melachim is about. It's about exile. So the story over here, which has some negative features to it, is put into the book of Melachim. But fundamentally, and here the academics are correct, that this is an end to the book of Shmuel. The book of Samuel has two endings, and this is the second of the two. Now let us begin. And it's clear that it feels like the same author. And as we'll see, these two chapters play off many of the themes we encounter in the book of Shmuel. So let's begin now with verse number 5. V'Adoniya ben Chagit mitnasei lemor ani amloch. Vayas lo rechev u'parashim v'chamishim ish ratzim lefanav. So Adoniya ben Chagit, David's son, he's David's fourth son. He was promoting himself. Mitnasei, promoting himself. Mitnasei means to be high up. You have, for example, in the Megillah, when Haman is introduced, after these things, Kidal HaMelech Achashverosh et Haman b'hamdato agagi vayinasehu. He raised him up. He placed his chair, it said, his throne or his chair above all the others. The sense of Haman being raised up. And here we have mitnaseh. Adoniya ben Chagit raises himself up. He's saying, I will be the king, because after all, he's the next oldest son. Son number 1 is dead. Son number 2 is irrelevant. Son number 3 is Avshalom is dead. He's son number 4. So he's the natural candidate to be king. So he's raising himself up. And not only that, he arranges for himself Rechev u'Parashim, chariots and horses, with 50 people running before him. So he hires out people to run before him. He has his, his press agents. He has his promoters. And in any event, the idea of Rechev u'Parashim, by the way, we encountered earlier in the book of Shmuel. Does anybody remember where in the book of Shmuel we have someone who has Rechev u'Parashim? Anybody remember that? Anybody want to speak up? Where do we have Rechev u'Parashim? Someone who promotes himself in similar fashion. Let's find that. That is chapter 15 of 2 Samuel, Shmuel Bet, the very first pasuk. Vayhi me'acharei chen, vayaso Avshalom merkava v'susim, v'chamishim ish ratzim lefanav. So we have exactly the same verse. Avshalom made for himself Rechev Parashim, 50 people running in front of him. So what Adonijah is doing is something similar. Now Avshalom did it. His father was very much alive. His father was the king. Avshalom wants to take over the kingship from his father. Also wants to kill his father. So in describing Adonijah in the same fashion, we have, I would say, a critique of Adonijah. He's setting himself up as king. He's promoting himself but his father is still alive. We don't know what David knows or doesn't know, but Hamelech David Zaken, King David was old. He's still King David. So we have over here a son who's in a sense usurping his father's kingship. His father's still alive. And there is, I think, a strong critique of Adonijah in this case. And the next pasuk makes it clear that there's a critique. Because the next pasuk says, "V'lo atzavo aviv miyamav lemar madua kacha asita." His father had not literally saddened him or scolded him, saying, "Why do you behave this way?" His father never critiqued his son, and that's why his son thinks he can behave this way without any approbation, with approbation, with approval, because his father had never told him, "You don't act this way." And now the text continues, "V'gamhu tov toar ma'od v'yoto yoda acharei Avshalom." He was very handsome. He was born after Avshalom. So born after Avshalom means he's the next oldest. He's the one in line for the kingship, naturally in line for the kingship. But there is here, apart from being naturally on line for the kingship, it's describing him as Avshalom. He's an Avshalom character. But he's an Avshalom character in the negative side of Avshalom. Avshalom is very handsome, very beautiful, the most beautiful person. And Adonijah is similar in that respect. But what Adonijah doesn't have, so he never mentioned and never suggested, it doesn't have the other side of Avshalom, the Avshalom who protects his sister, the Avshalom who cares about justice, that we don't have with Adonijah ben Chagit. And we also have something else over here, which is important for later on. Vayaslo Rechev u'Parashim, v'chamishim ish ratzim lefanav. It says he made for himself Rechev and Parashim and the 50 people running before him. And what that suggests is that he's the one setting it up. We don't know who actually supports this character. We know that he's arranging all of the promotional stuff. He's hiring the people. But does he actually have support? We have no idea if he actually has support. Before we continue, I'll pause for a moment. Does anybody want to comment or speak up at this point about what we've seen so far? You know, if people are comfortable, it would be good if you could turn on your video so we can see each other. as if we're in a class together. That would be a good thing. Does anybody want to comment about this, what we've seen so far, and before we continue our story? If you want to comment, just unmute and speak.
Did Avshalom, is Micah, did Avshalom did it show that he had support? Or is this just is Adoniyahu just, in other words, is there a difference between them in terms of showing its support?
Well, one thing we certainly know is that when Avshalom conquers Jerusalem, it's pretty clear from the book that most of Israel supports Avshalom. David has his, Avshalom, I think, has the support of the majority of Israel. He wins the popular vote. And I think that we don't know initially how much support he has, but certainly later on we know that he was the people's choice, for sure. We don't know anything yet about Adoniah. I think it becomes clear later that Adoniah doesn't have much support at all. And there's nothing to Adoniah. But I think that's a very important distinction between the two. Avshalom, we know why Avshalom is angry at David, and I would say that the reader has a lot of sympathy for Avshalom's position in the story of Amnon and Tamar. When it turns to Adoniah, it strikes us as a guy who's next in line for the kingship, but he doesn't want to wait. Can't wait for his father to pass on. His father obviously is old, sick. We don't know how much more time he has. But Adoniah is not waiting around, and he's already promoting himself. Ani Amloch, he says, I will be the king. And he's already acting as king. Thank you for that question. Anybody else want to speak? Don't hesitate, and just unmute yourself. All right, by the way, before we continue here, I wanted to just make the comment, and we may come back to this later, that the very beginning of the story, which is the people, these servants searching for the most beautiful woman to warm up the king, that the Megillah, of course, is well aware of the story over here, but the Megillah has the servants of the king suggesting not that one woman be brought to the king, yes, one woman to replace the queen, but in order to do that, to set up in every one of the 127 states, an entire apparatus to produce many, many women who will be taken. They're not being asked whether they want to come or not, taken to the king. It's kind of a grotesque parody on what we have in the beginning of the book of Melachim, Avishag Ashunamit. And I think that we should keep the Megillah in mind in the sense that it's a later work, but the Megillah, which is all about kingship and the workings of kingship, clearly the story of the Megillah has all kinds of very interesting connections to our story over here in Sefer Melachim. I would say we can say with some certainty that the Megillah has the story in mind as the Megillah is being written. One of the things the Megillah is thinking about is this particular story of Adoniah ben Chagit and the establishment of kingship, etc. And we'll see. But our primary text that we're thinking about at all times is the third story of Abraham, how he arranges for the marriage of Yitzchak and Rivka, and how Yitzchak and Rivka will take the place of Abraham and Sarah. Okay, now let us continue our story. We're in chapter 1, in the 7th pasuk. Vayud Varav, we're talking now about Adoniah ben Chagit, Im Yoav ben Sruya, V'im Evyatar Kohen, Vayazru Acharei Adoniah. So he spoke to two people. He spoke to Yoav, and he spoke to Evyatar. Yoav, as we know, was David's head of the army, David's commander-in-chief. He's the one who has saved David and Israel on more than one occasion, great warrior. We know that David has something against Yoav. We know that Yoav has on occasion not listened to what David said, and specifically, he's the one who kills Avshalom. Yoav killed Avshalom, but he is, without question, David's general. He also killed Avner. David did not fire him after that. He cursed him. So Yoav is cursed by David, but not fired by David. On the contrary, David relies upon Yoav. When he has the story with Uriah Hachiti in Bathsheba, it's Yoav that David sends a letter to have Uriah killed. That's as far as Yoav is concerned. He's his general. As far as Eviatar, he's David's priest. Eviatar is from the house of Eli, and he's the sole survivor of the massacre at Nov. The massacre of Nov, Shaul killed all the priests of Nov because David had taken refuge there, and there was someone else there who knew that David was there, namely Doeg HaAdomi, and he informs the Saul, King Shaul, who kills all the priests of Nov. One priest escapes, Eviatar. He becomes David's priest, but he's from the house of Eli. The house of Eli is cursed in the beginning of the book of Shmuel. So the two main people that David has with him, his two main supporters, Yoav, his general, and Eviatar, his priest, have something in common with each other. They're both cursed. The house of Yoav is cursed by David in the beginning of Shmuel Bet. The house of Eli is cursed by the prophet in the beginning of Shmuel Aleph. And these are the two people, and David's two main people. These are two people. It says, Vaya'azru acharei Adoniyahu. Vaya'azru. La'azar means to help, to assist. So even in terms of their support, it's assistance. The main player here is Adoniah ben Chagit, and these two people are assisting him. And the next verse tells us that V'tzadok HaKohen, Ubenayahu ben Yehoyada, V'natan HaNavi, V'shemi V'reyi, V'yagi Barim Asher David, Lo Hayu im Adoniyahu. So it says, however, the support of Adoniyahu, and we have it on our screen, I see, the support of Adoniyahu is not total, quite the opposite. We have a bunch of people that don't support him. Sadok HaKohen, he's David's other priest. Benayahu ben Yehoyada, he doesn't support him. Natan HaNavi, the prophet Nathan doesn't support him. Shimi v'Rei, I have no idea who Shimi and Rei are. And as far as I could tell, neither does anybody else. But they're supporters of David. V'yagi Barim, and the David strongmen that are listed at the end of the book of Shmuel, these great valiant warriors. Lo hayu im Adoniyahu. So he doesn't have their support. So there's a division within David's camp. There are two who support him, two very important people who do support him, and there are a whole bunch of people that don't support him. Now, when you look at the people that do support and the people that don't support, there's something interesting about that. And that is that each one has a priest. There's a priest who does support Eviatar. There's a priest who doesn't support Tzadok. There are military people who do support. There's Yoav, commander-in-chief. He does support. But there's Benayahu ben Yehoyada. He's a great warrior. They're the Giborim. They don't support. Shimi v'Rei, I have no idea who they are. No clue. But there's one person who has no parallel on the other side that's very important. And that is Natan HaNavi. Natan HaNavi is a prophet. He's a Navi. He doesn't support. And that's significant because we remember, of course, that the kings of Israel, Saul and David, are appointed by the prophet. It's the prophet who appoints Saul. It's the prophet who is privately in chapter 16 who anoints David. Shmuel anoints both of them, actually. So the fact that the prophet doesn't support Adoniah is very significant. Yes, please. Someone who wants to speak? No? Okay. So if you want to speak, just unmute and speak up, please. And now we have the next verse, which is verse number 9. Vayizbach Adoniyahu tzonu bakar umari Im Eben Azochelet, Asher Eitzo Ein Rogel, Vayikra et Kol Echav B'nei HaMelech, U'chol Anshe Yehuda Avdei HaMelech. So Adoniah brings the sacrifice. And we remember from the study of Shmuel that both when Saul is made king, anointed by Samuel, and when David is anointed by Samuel, one in chapter 9 of Shmuel Aleph, one in chapter 16 of Shmuel Aleph, on both occasions, the setting is sacrifice. So the sacrificial setting has been in the book of Shmuel, the setting for the choosing of the king. Here as well, Adoniah brings the sacrifice. In the other two cases, it's the prophet that brings the sacrifice. Here it's Adoniah himself who brings the sacrifice. And to this meal, he invites people. In the case of Saul, where the sacrificial meals, there were 30 people there. You have to be invited. When Shmuel brings the sacrifice in chapter 9. In the case of David, the sacrifice is brought in the presence of his family, Yishai and David's brothers. Here he's inviting all of his brothers to come, all the people of Judah. But there's some people who don't get invited. In verse number 10, V'et Natan Lavi u'Benayahu v'et Agiborim v'et Shlomo Achiv lo kara. Now that verse number 10 is interesting because whom he doesn't invite is striking. Whom he doesn't invite are the people mentioned earlier that don't support him. Sadok is one, Benayahu is two, Natan is three. And it's interesting that in the ones who don't support him earlier, it mentions Shimei and Rei. We don't know who Shimei and Rei are, but in terms of the people not being invited, it doesn't mention Shimei and Rei not being invited. It mentions Sadok, it mentions Benayahu, it mentions Natan, but instead of Shimei and Rei, there's a different name, namely Shlomo. V'et Shlomo Achiv lo kara. So Shlomo, maybe that's why Shimei and Rei are mentioned earlier, actually, so they can be replaced by Shlomo. And suddenly, the fact that he's not inviting Shlomo, he invites all of his brothers, except for Shlomo, suggests to us, and for the first time we're seeing this, that maybe Shlomo is actually seen as a candidate, otherwise, or seen as a non-supporter by Adoniah. By not inviting Shlomo, he invites every brother except for Shlomo. It means suddenly Adoniah sees Shlomo as problematic. Now, when the king of Israel sees you as problematic, we know, or any king for that matter, we know what that might entail for you. Certainly nothing positive. So Shlomo might already be in danger, but he's being singled out over here. And now I wanted to reflect for a moment upon Shlomo. What's very interesting is, who is Shlomo? So Shlomo is the son of Bathsheba. Not the first son of Bathsheba. The first son of Bathsheba dies. The prophet goes to David and says, the prophet is Natan HaNavi, goes to David at the end of the Bathsheba story and says that after David says, I've sinned against God, so the prophet says in chapter 12 of Shmuel Bet, God is going to forgive you in the sense you won't die, but this child that's born to you will die. And that child dies. The child that was born to David and Bathsheba, when she was still the wife of Uriah, essentially. So that child dies. And that child, in a sense, prefigures what's going to happen to David, because other children die as well. Amnon dies, and Avshalom dies. Adoniah will die as well. Not yet. So that's the first child born to Bathsheba. But then there's another child born to Bathsheba at the end of chapter 12. And when that child is born, let's take a look, if you have your Tanakh, to chapter 12, the end of chapter 12, the end of the story of David and Bathsheba. It's chapter 12, verse number 24 and verse number 25. Afterwards, after the first child dies, so the text says, "Vayinachem David et Bathsheba ishto, vayavo eleh vayeshkav ima, vateled ben, vatikrat Shlomo Shlomo, Vashem ahivo." David consoled Bathsheba after the death of Uriah. Bathsheba mourns for the death of her husband Uriah, and he sleeps with her. He consoles her and sleeps with her, and she gave birth to a child. And here we have, it's interesting, we have Vayikra and Vatikra. So the thread is Vatikra. She named his name Shlomo, and God loved him. God favored him. Vashem ahivo, which means God's not going to kill this one. The first child dies, but the second child will live. And now we have verse number 25. Vayishlach biyad Natan hanavi. He sent. Who was he? Perhaps God. Sent through Natan hanavi. Vayikra et shemo Yedidya. He named him Yedidya. He named this child Yedidya ba'avur Hashem. On account of God, because of God. Who named him Yedidya, actually? This child Shlomo has another name. He's named Yedidya, Yedidya. Yedid is beloved, the beloved of God. Who named him? Is God naming him? Is Nathan naming him? Or is David naming him? It's very hard to know, actually. I mean, if I had to pick one, I might pick Nathan. He sends, in other words, we're told that God loves him, but in verse 25, a message is sent to David through Natan, and he calls his name Yedidya. Maybe David did this when Natan tells him, or maybe Natan does it. It's unclear. But Yedidya is a very interesting name. A Yedid is a beloved one, and the name Yedid reminds us of a different name, which is the name David. David is the beloved one, Dodim. Right? Dodim, Yedidya, Yedid, sounds like, and maybe even related to the name David. So this child bears David's name, beloved. Now we know that the reason David eliminates Uriah HaChitti, we suspect, was a political as well as a personal reason. The child that will be born is a potential king. So David doesn't want that child actually to be born if his mother is married to somebody else. Kings don't like that. So he tries to suggest that the child is really Uriah's child by sending Uriah home. That doesn't work. Ends up killing Uriah. That's the first child. But this child is born to Bathsheba, and actually the verse when David sleeps with Bathsheba is a positive one. Vayinachem, he consoles her. He consoles her. It's very positive, actually. So here's the point. It sounds like Shlomo is a viable candidate to succeed his father. He bears his name. God loves him. And this is the last we hear of Shlomo in the book of Shmuel. It's never mentioned again. The entire question of succession revolves around Avshalom and Amnon, the oldest. That's the very next story. Amnon and Avshalom are rivals. They're both the sons of David. And the text, as it were, forgets completely about this little Shlomo. He's a non-player at all in the rest of Sefer Shmuel. Until we come here to this verse, where his older brother, son number 4, proclaims himself king, hires a band, as it were, has a big party, he's going to crown himself as king, invites all the brothers except for Shlomo. And then you get a sense that suddenly we realize that Shlomo actually is a viable candidate. That's how we realize it, by virtue of his not being invited. Then we go back to that verse and we say, I wondered about this Shlomo, this Yedidya. What is his role? We haven't heard a word about Yedidya. So that's a very important point as we proceed. Who will succeed David? Open question. How's it going to happen? So far, it's not a very pretty story. And it doesn't get any prettier either. Okay, I will stop here for a moment. Does anybody want to comment or question?
Where do we see that God loves someone else? I mean, should we have realized at this point that this has to be the one? Is there any other mention of God loving anyone in in these stories.
No, there is no, I think we, the reader, I mean, to come back to what we had last week, I don't think when you're reading the story over here, I think we have actually, and understandably, forgotten about Shlomo altogether. After Shlomo, you have these incredibly interesting stories of Amnon and Avshalom and Sheva ben Bichri and Yoav and all the drama. So the reader has forgotten about it. And now we suddenly remember that Shlomo is a candidate. I want to come back to what we had last week. It is not clear who will succeed David. David, unlike Abraham, who says we have to get a successor, David is completely silent in the story. Either he's silent at this point because he doesn't know what's going on. That's possible. But in any event, he's been silent till now. He hasn't actually, in the book of Shmuel, he hasn't chosen anybody. In the book of Divrei Hayamim, it's completely different. There he actually chooses Shlomo. In Divrei Hayamim, there's only one possible successor. It's Shlomo, and they're actually working together before David dies. They're actually building the Beis Hamikdash together. They're planning it all out. There's one successor. The point over here is there's no successor. David has done nothing to choose anybody, when actually he's capable of choosing. And the people in the court are trying to figure out what to do over here. The people in the court are choosing, the idea of finding someone who serves a kind of a electric blanket for David, namely Avishag the Shunammite. It's not a pretty story. It's a very different, it's in a way, very dark story. But my point is that suddenly we realize there's another possibility besides Adoniah ben Chagit. I would add to your comment that the fact that Yoav and Eviatar support Adoniah, okay, Adoniah may be a total jerk, but in point of fact, I don't think we have to see Yoav as being disloyal to David. I mean, I think in the book of Shmuel, I don't see Yoav, he may be disloyal to David the person, but he's always loyal to David's kingship. The problem is that sometimes David the person may be disloyal to his own kingship, like the Avshalom story. I wish I had died instead of you, Avshalom. And Yoav says, well, if he lives and you die, we're all killed. You can't. So the point is we don't know, I think. It's all about not knowing. But suddenly we have this other possibility. We may have a struggle for a fight. Who's going to be the child to succeed? Anybody else have something to comment? Thank you for that. Anybody else? Speak up. Well, if you have comments, please, at any point, you just unmute and talk up. I will continue now in verse number 11. Vayomer Natan el bat Sheva em Shlomo lemar. Halo shamat ki malach Adoniyahu ben Chagit. V'Adonenu David lo yada. So Natan HaNavi, he's a prophet. But in this chapter, he's not just a prophet, he's also a politician. He goes to Bathsheba. He says, you must have heard that Adoniah has proclaimed himself king, and our Lord David does not know. Lo yada. He makes it very clear. David doesn't know. Lo yada. And now he says, V'ata l'chi ilatzechna etzah. He says to her, let me give you a piece of advice. Umaltiat nafshech v'et nefesh b'nech Shlomo. And you will save your own life and the life of your son, Shlomo. So what he's saying to her is, listen, if Adoniah declares himself king, your life is in danger and your son Shlomo's life is in danger. The not inviting Shlomo to the party has great political significance and in fact suggests that if he becomes the king, you will be eliminated, you and your son. And therefore he says, go to the king. V'yomarte lav, halo ata Adoni HaMelech, nishbata lamatcha lemar. Oh, my Lord the king, you took an oath to your maidservant. You swore to me, saying, Shlomo b'nech yimloch acharai, v'hu yeshev al kisi. That Shlomo, my son, Bathsheba's son, will be the king, he will sit on my throne. Umadua malach Adonio. Why is Adonio reigning? Why is Adonio the king? Notice that the word madua is related to the word yada. So madua. David lo yada, and asked the king madua. Why? Hine odach medaber shamim hamelech, and while you're busy talking to the king, ani avo acharayich, I'll come after you. Umileti et dvarayich. What does mileti et dvarayich mean? There are two possibilities what mileti, to fill in. It could mean, I will fill in the blanks. You'll say, you make one claim, and I'll fill it in. I'll say other things. I'll have a different approach, which will try to convince the king to fill in. Or mileti could have a different meaning, which is to confirm. I will confirm your words. In other words, you're going to claim X. I'm going to come in and confirm it. Now, he's not going to confirm it by saying what she said is true. He's going to confirm it in a different way. But it's a two-pronged attack on the king. We're trying to get the king to choose Shlomo as the king. And Natan HaNavi says, oh, you better do this, he says to her, because otherwise your life is in danger. Now let's just pause a moment and reflect upon this conversation, which is very interesting. For one thing, it's the prophet who is behind the, one could call it the manipulation of David, or to convince David. David doesn't know, says the Navi. David doesn't know. Doesn't know about what? Doesn't know what Adoniah is doing? It's hard to believe that he doesn't know what Adoniah is doing. Adoniah has invited every one of David's sons to the party and all the people of Judah to the party. And he has 50 people running in the street. And David doesn't know? How could David not know? Well, one possibility is David doesn't know anything. He doesn't know what's flying, as we say. He doesn't know what's going on. He's out of it. Possible. In any event, David doesn't know. And here it's interesting. I mentioned before that, well, before that. And then he says, go to the king and tell the king that you, my lord, swore to me that my son will be the king and my son will sit on your throne. How come the other guy is the king? And the question, of course, that is highly significant is whether or not David actually took such an oath. There's certainly no statement in the book of Shmuel that David swore that Shlomo will be the king. David, it's not recorded as such. And in fact, one can only wonder why, if David in fact did swear, why the prophet, Natan, has to go to Bathsheba and instruct her to remind the king. You would think that if he swore to her, maybe she would go herself. Okay, maybe not. Maybe she doesn't want to go into the king. Maybe she's afraid. But here's the question. Was there an oath or no oath? And we don't really know. Either way, it's problematic. If there was an oath, then why isn't David keeping his word? And if there was no oath, why are they telling him that he swore? So either way, we have a very deep problem over here. But I did want to mention something else about Natan HaNavi and his place in the story. And that is, we have to remember that when Natan HaNavi was the one in the Bathsheba incident who said to David, you are the man. He gives the parable, you are the man, you are the guilty one, and here's the punishment. The sword will come from your own house. He will take your wives publicly. He'll sleep with your wives publicly. So it's all the story of Avshalom. It's predicted by Natan HaNavi as a punishment to David. You killed this man, you took his wife, you killed him with the sword of Ammon. So the one who said to David, you are a sinner. What you did is a terrible sin and you pay a terrible price, was Natan HaNavi. And his partner in crime, and we don't know if she's seen as complicit in the text or not, because maybe she had no choice. The king summoned her, is Bathsheba. So this child, this Shlomo, has a cloud hanging over him. He's born to the woman that was taken illegitimately by the king. So the question is, can this child, who could be seen as highly problematic, is he worthy to be the king or not? So from this perspective, it's very important that Natan HaNavi, that the prophet, is the one who says that Shlomo should be the king. Because the merry man who condemned David for his action is the very one who says that Shlomo shall be the king. And we also remember that Shlomo himself was the message from God to David that Shlomo was beloved of God, was brought by Natan, and someone named him Yedidia. The someone might be Natan HaNavi. And if Natan HaNavi names him, I would say Natan HaNavi is sort of the Sanduk. He's sort of the godfather of Shlomo. Shlomo is David's son, but the act of naming is an act of parenthood. So it's quite conceivable that Natan HaNavi has a vested interest over here. He, of course, the main interest is that he wants the king to be better than Adoniah ben Chagit, who's very problematic, who has no redeeming features at all. But Shlomo is beloved of God, and not only that, named by Natan HaNavi. So the story recalls for us the story of David and Bathsheba. One of the problems is, can this child actually be king? He's one might say he's almost an illegitimate child. Can he be the king or not? So Natan is very important from that perspective. So these are the instructions. Go to the king, and you have to go to the king to save yourself, he says, and to save your son, and in effect to save the kingship. And this reminds us, of course, of a similar story where a man tells a woman, you go to the king. You have to save yourself and you have to save me, but above all, you have to save the Jewish people. And of course, that story is the Megillah. So the Megillah is in this story top to bottom. And actually in the Megillah, when you read it, it's even more frightening in a sense. Suddenly you realize something about the Megillah, which is in the story over here, it's going to be a joint effort. You go to the king, you speak to the king. I'm going to come in and fill in your words, literally. So we have a two-pronged attack. You're going to say one thing as wife. I'm going to say something else as prophet and friend. And between the two of us, let's see if we can save the day. But in the case of the Megillah, it's Mordechai that gives the instructions to Esther. But speaking to the king, Mordechai doesn't say a word. It's Esther who has to go alone and go alone into the inner chamber of the king, as Bathsheba will do. But in the case of the Megillah, entering the inner chamber of the king can cause you to be killed. That's what Esther says. So the sense of Esther going alone and heroically alone is highlighted when you read the two stories together. Because here she doesn't go alone. She goes herself. He's going to go with her in a sense and confirm her words or add, supplement, I would say, supplement her words. Now we have what happens in the story. Vatikod Bathsheba Vatishtachu HaMelech. I'm sorry, verse 15. Vatavo Bathsheba El HaMelech HaChadra. Bathsheba walked into the king's cheder, means his private bedroom, basically. Walks into his private spaces. V'Hamelech Zakein Ma'od. The king was very old. V'Avishag HaShunamit Misharat Et HaMelech. He walks in there, and Avishag the Shunamit is with the king. Now, why did the text actually mention Avishag the Shunamit over here? What is the point? I mean, one point clearly is that she's there to warm him up, actually. So she's walking into the king's inner chamber, maybe his bedroom, in a place of intimacy, just as Esther walked into the inner court. Can't walk into the inner court. She walks into the inner court, but seeing Avishag the Shunammite with the king certainly reminds us of, in a sense, Avishag the Shunammite is the younger version of Bathsheba. It's a beautiful woman, as is Bathsheba. And we are reminded of that episode as she walks in there. And the episode, of course, is part of the problem. Maybe one of the reasons that David hasn't spoken out publicly in favor of Shlomo is that incident. We don't know for sure. She's going to the inner chamber. Interesting, she doesn't have to be announced in the story over here. For example, when Natan HaNavi will come to see the king, which is later on in verse number 22, Natan HaNavi comes in verse 22, and verse 23, Vayagidu HaMelech Lemar Hinei Natan HaNavi. And he's announced. You don't just walk into the king's bedroom, to the inner places of the king, and just have a conversation with the king. Except there's some people that can walk in. Bathsheba can walk into the inner chamber. She doesn't need an invitation. That's his wife. That's different. So the wife it's interesting. The wife he's a politician, he's a prophet, he's an official. There are protocols. When it comes to the wife, though, she can just walk in. That's the advantage of Bathsheba. In any event, the king is very old. Abishag Shunammite is there. And now back to verse number 16. Vatikod Bathsheba Vatishtachu HaMelech. And she comes and she bows down. Vayom HaMelech Malach. And the king says, what do you want? Vatomelo, Adoni, my lord. Atanish bata b'Hashem Elohecha labotecha. You swore by God. You took a shvua. Ki shlomo b'nech yimloch acharei. You said, and she's quoting what he said. She doesn't say Shlomo b'ni, my son. You said the following: your son Solomon will reign after me. He will sit on my throne. She says exactly the language that Natan told her to say. He's prepared her very well. This is a speech. This is what you have to say to the king. He's behind the whole thing. V'ata hinei Adoni malach. V'ata Adoni hamelech lo yadata. And behold, Adoniah is the king, and my lord king does not know it. You're certainly unaware of this, she's saying, because if you were aware of it, you would certainly keep your word. So obviously you don't know. But in fact, he's the king, but you swore in this language. This is what you said. And not only did he make himself the king, but in verse 19, Vayizbach shar umari v'tzon larov. He brought many sacrifices. Vayikro l'chol b'nei hamelech, and he called all the sons of the king. U'evyatara kohen, u'yoav sarat tzava, v'lishlomo avdecha lo kara. He called all the sons of the king, and he called Eviatar the priest and Yoav, but Shlomo, your servant, he did not call.
Rabbi,
yes.
This is Micah. Just a quick question. I may have said this in the past. I don't know. But in any event, I noticed that about the reference to Adonia and Adoni. Seems to be an implication that you guys are. He's trying to take your position.
I think that's an excellent observation. Micah says, everybody heard this, Micah points out that Adoniah and Adoni, that she's playing with the name Adoniah. What she's suggesting to him is, apart from everything else, the chutzpah of him calling himself Adon, when in fact you are still the Adon. In other words, what she's saying is, perhaps, subtext, and the way you can demonstrate that you are the Adon is by making a decision. He's making all the choices. He's decided what's going to happen. He sees himself as the Adon. But in fact, I don't see it that way. You are Adoni. You're still the king. David is still the king. So your comment that the playing of Adoniah and Adoni over here is a very good one, I think, a very significant. Notice, by the way, that when she lists the invitees to the party, she mentions the sons of the king first. In the initial mentioning, the sons of the king, it's Eviatar and Yoav are mentioned first. But from her perspective, as the mother of this child, and the one to whom David swore, your son shall succeed me. So from her perspective, it is significant that he invited all of them except for your servant Shlomo. All of them invited except for Shlomo. Now she says in verse 20, V'ata Adoni HaMelech, and now my lord the king. Yes, Adoni comes up over and over. Einei kol Yisrael alecha, everybody looks to you. Lagidu lahem mi yeshev al kisei Adoni HaMelech acharav, who will sit on your throne after you are gone. V'aya kishkav Adoni HaMelech im avotav, And it will come to pass when in fact you die. For Yiti ani ubni Shlomo chatoim, then I and your son and my son Shlomo will be chatoim. Now the word chatoim is very interesting. Chatoim, the word chet is a sin. And she says, after you die, me and Shlomo will be chatoim. Now I think the chatoim has two meanings over here. One is that she's saying we will be seen as sinners. That is to say, we will be seen after you die, the king of Israel, who's Adoniah, will see us as sinners in the sense, see us as rebels, see us as non-supporters. After all, he didn't invite Shlomo even now. That's one meaning. So we'll be in danger because the king will see us as potential enemies, as potential rivals. That's one possibility. But the word chataim carries with it another valence. We'll be seen as sinners in the sense that people will say, why didn't he choose Shlomo? And the answer is, well, he couldn't choose Shlomo as king. Shlomo was born in sin. Shlomo was born to a woman who's married to somebody else. Shlomo was born to the wife of Uriah HaChitti. People will think that the reason you passed over Shlomo is because of our sin. She puts it in terms of herself. That's the second possibility. The third possibility is that the word chataim doesn't mean sinners at all, but it maybe had that secondary meaning. But the word chet in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, has another meaning, which means to miss the mark. For example, in the end of the book of Shoftim, talking about the Benjaminites who were expert bowsmen. They could shoot at a barley seed, below yachati. They would not miss the mark. So one might say, maybe after you die, me and Shlomo will be missing and presumed dead. We won't be able to be found. Who knows where we'll end up? And there is also the valence of chataim, so it carries with it several different valences. They don't contradict each other. And I was thinking that actually this is in keeping with the book of Shmuel, because the book of Shmuel on two occasions plays a similar game. Here we have the word chet, but on two other occasions in the book of Shmuel, we have one time the word avon, which is sin, and one time the word pesha, which is sin. Chet, avon, and pesha, three words for sin. And after the story of David and Goliath, and the women come out and they dance and they say Saul killed his thousands, and David killed his 10,000s. Vayishol oyein et David. So Saul was oyein, hated, suspicious of David from that day on. But the word oyein et David probably is playing on also the word avon. Saul sees David as one who was sinful. And David himself picks it up later on when David talks to Jonathan. And David says to Jonathan, your father's out to kill me. And Jonathan said to David, what are you talking about? My father tells me everything. If he was out to kill you, I would know it. So David says to him, no, he's out to kill me, but he knows that you favor me. He doesn't want to tell you. But I'm telling you something. Ki kepesa beini ubein hamavet. There's a pesa. A pesa is, in modern Hebrew too, we've saw pisi as a step. There's one step between me and death. But in the Hebrew, in the book of Shmuel, pesa is written not pei samach ayin, but it's written pei sin ayin. Pesa with a sin, not with a samach. Now pei sin ayin, the biblical text is not vocalized. The word pesa can be read pesha. I would say in English, there's one misstep between me and death. He's looking for some excuse to kill me. He's going to find some fault with me, and he'll kill me. That's pesha, a misstep. So the book of Samuel plays with oven and with pesha and now with chet. And it means the same thing in all three cases. He'll find some excuse to kill me. He'll find that I did something wrong. He's going to find an excuse, a pretext. So therefore, the king, it's up to you. I know you don't know, but on the other hand, you swore to me. You took an oath. We don't know if he took the oath or didn't take the oath, but Natan HaNavi has sent her on a mission, and she's fulfilling what Natan HaNavi said, and she's spelling it out. She talks as the wife, and David's intimate, the wife, and this is the child that you promised, and our lives are in danger. You have to do something about it. That's what she says, follows the cue, does a very nice job, and she's there. And now, in the next verse, here comes Natan HaNavi to literally to supplement her words. And that's verse 22. Natan comes. In verse 23, he's announced. Hinei Natan HaNavi, vayavo lefnei hamelech. In verse 23, vayishtachu hamelech al apav arza. He bows down to the king. And now verse 24. Vayomer Natan, Adoni hamelech, my lord the king, Ata amarta Adoniya yimloch acharai, v'hu yeshev al kisi. So again, there's no question marks, there's no punctuation in the text, but it sounds like a question. And Nathan said to David, did you say, my lord king, did you say that Adoniya shall be the king, that he will sit on my throne? Ki yoran hayom, he went down today. Vayizbach shor umari v'tzon larov, he brought many sacrifices. Vayikro l'chol b'nei hamelech, he invited the sons of the king. U'l'sarei hatzava, and the officers of the army, that's not mentioned earlier. He supplements that. Many army officers. U'Eviatar HaKohen, and Eviatar the priest. V'hinam ochlim v'shotim lifanav, and they're eating and drinking before him. That he supplements, that doesn't say that earlier. Eating and drinking, of course, is not just biological, it's social. They're making a big party. They seem to be supporting him as king. Vayomru Yechi HaMelech Adoniyahu, and they're saying, long live King Adoniyahu. That's not mentioned earlier. Maybe it did happen that way, maybe it didn't happen that way, we'll never know. But he adds other information. He's already the king. He's not just planning to be the king. Long live the king, they're saying. And they're eating and drinking. There's a big party and a kind of inauguration. And he says, V'li ani avdecha, but me, your servant, u'tzadok HaKohen, and Tzadok the priest, v'livna Yah ben Yehoyada, v'lishlomo avdecha lo kara, and he didn't invite, he mentions 4 people, Tzadok, Benayahu, army man, me, prophet, and Shlomo. So he singles out Shlomo. And he puts Shlomo as, he calls Shlomo Abdecha, your servant. And he calls himself your servant. So Natan is saying that me and Shlomo are actually linked. Not inviting me and not inviting Shlomo, that's the same thing. And remember that Natan is important, he's the prophet. So the other side doesn't have a prophet. And we know that in the book of Shmuel, the prophet is the one who chooses the king, because at the end of the day, it's God who chooses the king. And that's the problem with Avshalom, and that's the problem with Adoniah. No prophet chooses them. And now Natan continues. In verse number 27, very interesting verse. If this matter comes from the king, you didn't inform your servant. He says, if this matter comes from you, why didn't you inform me? Why didn't you tell me? Lo hodata, who shall sit on your throne after you? Now this verse I found extremely interesting, because we're told earlier, when Natan HaNavi goes to Bathsheba, he says to her, Adoni HaMelech, Adonenu David lo yada. Our Lord David does not know. He's very explicit about this. Adoniah ben Chagit is making himself the king, planning to be the king, declaring himself as king. King David does not know. Black and white, doesn't know. But now when Natan talks to David, he says, hey, I don't know. He's made himself the king. I presume he did this with your approval. How come he didn't tell me? I'm your servant. You should have told me. The fact that you didn't tell me, maybe you don't. Maybe he's doing it. Maybe it's the wrong thing. Maybe it's not your doing. You didn't tell me. But he presents it as if he's not sure that he's not sure. He says, you must know about it. Why didn't you tell me? But that's not true. Natan HaNavi knows that David doesn't know about it. And in fact, the reader pretty much knows. It's likely David doesn't know, because that's how the book begins, with Avishai the Shunammite. He knew or not. How much does this man know altogether? So what that tells us is something about the court. It's not about David per se. David seems perhaps out of it at this point. Maybe David will wake up now, but till now we don't know. But there's something about the court, and that's what the Megillah picks up on as well. The problem with kingship is not just the particular king. The problem with kingship is, potentially, he sets up an apparatus of kingship. In the apparatus of kingship, it's not just that the king is political. The king makes promises he doesn't keep. But the entire apparatus is such that it's virtually impossible to be an honest person. Even the prophet can't actually speak the whole truth. Natan HaNavi is the prophet, but he's also part of David's court. He pretends, in talking to David, well, you must have known. I sort of take it personally. How come you didn't tell me? But he knows David doesn't know. He pretends that David knows but didn't tell him. Of course, that is not what he really believes. He believes David does not know. So they're coming from two different perspectives. The two of them come together, unlike the Megillah, where it's just Esther. It's very personal. Bathsheba is totally personal. But over here, it's Natan suggesting that, number one, he doesn't have the support of many people, including me. And therefore, choosing him is problematic. The entire behavior is problematic. And that the king has to act immediately. It's not that Adoniah plans to be king. It's that he's already acting as king. He already has his inaugural ball. It's time to act now. So the two come together with two different arguments. One from the perspective of the friend, prophet, politician, and the other, the aggrieved wife to whom David took a promise. It's very personal, and it's also business. And the two of them come together in this book. It's not one or the other. This is the dual approach over here, orchestrated by Natan HaNavi. And now we have David's response, which is terrific. Vayan Hamelech David Vayomer Kiru Liga Bathsheba. Call Bathsheba. Vatavo Lifnei Hamelech Vatamod Lifnei Hamelech. She stands before the king. Vayishava Hamelech Vayomar. And now David takes an oath. Chay Hashem asher poda nafshi mikol tzara. I swear by the God who has saved me from all evil. That expression, by the way, appears also in the beginning of Shmuel Aleph. Exactly those words. David takes an oath. The oath over there was in the context of killing the people who had assassinated Ishbosheth, Saul's son. I swear by the God who saved me, I'm not going to countenance this. Over here as well. Ki kasher nishbati lach b'Hashem Elohei Yisrael lemar, that the oath that I took to you earlier, by the God in God's name, Ki shlomo b'nech yimloch acharai v'hu yeshev al kisi tachtai, that Solomon my son will reign after me and sit on my throne. Kein e'aseh hayom hazeh, I will do this right now. So David takes an oath, which he will fulfill. I'm going to make Shlomo the king, and I'm going to do it now. Now, what's interesting is he does take an oath, and as we pointed out in the past, the name of the woman to whom he speaks is Bathsheba. Bat can mean possessor of, like a bat mitzvah, possessor of mitzvot, obligated in mitzvot. Sheva, 7, often is connected to the word shvua, Beersheba, kisham nishba'u shnehem. Her name is possessor of the oath. She is certainly the possessor of the oath, because David swears to her now that David will fulfill his oath. The problem is actually that it's a strange formulation. I promised to fulfill the oath that I took earlier. But did he take the oath earlier or not? Who knows? We really don't know. So it's still problematic, but he does swear. And I would add to this verse the thought that in the Torah, in the story of the passing on of the patriarchal blessing from Abraham and Sarah to Isaac and Rebekah, in that beautiful story, Isaac becomes the patriarch in the lifetime of Abraham. When the servant's going home and Rebekah sees Isaac, who's that walking in the field? This is my master. Say Adoni, this is my Lord. But the one that sent the servant was Abraham. But as soon as Rebekah meets Isaac, Isaac replaces Abraham as the patriarch, who Adoni. And you have, in other words, one patriarch replaces the other in the life of the first patriarch. And over here we have a similar idea. Shlomo will become the king, not after David dies, but Shlomo is going to become the king in the lifetime of his father. That's what David will instruct in the next psukim. David will instruct that Shlomo now take Shlomo and put him, for example, in verse number 33, let Solomon ride on my mule, bring him down to Gihon. In other words, he's going to literally Yoshev al Kisi. He will sit on my throne while I am still alive. The kingship will be established for David when David is still alive. So that's an interesting parallel between the patriarchal narrative, where the patriarchal leadership is passed on. Abraham cedes it to Yitzchak. Yitzchak replaces Abraham in Abraham's lifetime as patriarch the moment that Rivka is brought into the picture, because she replaces Sarah, who has died. But Isaac replaces Abraham in his lifetime. And that's exactly the point over here. It becomes necessary to make a statement while David is still alive that Shlomo will be the king, and in fact, not just will be the king, in fact, is the king. And Bathsheba's response in verse number 31, Batikol Bathsheba apayim eretz, Batishtachu amelech, Bathsheba bowed down to the king, Vatomer, Yechi Adoni Hamelech David Liolam, may my Lord King live forever. And that statement, may my Lord King live forever, has two different meanings, I think. One is David has just said, I'm turning the kingship over to Shlomo. Normally when you turn the kingship over to somebody else, it takes place after the death of the first one. The son replaces the father in the book of Kings. So she's saying, thank you for making him the king, but you should live forever. That's one possible meaning. But there's an additional meaning of it, which is, my Lord King will rule forever, which means something very different. Because the fact of the matter is, David doesn't live forever. Nobody does. But David's kingship is eternal. But when is David's kingship going to happen? When does David establish kingship? He only establishes kingship when you have succession. So now that David says Shlomo is going to replace me as my successor, so Bathsheba says to David, may your kingship rule be forever. David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam. The kingship of David, actually, the blessing of kingship, is not just the person David, but it's Malchut David. It's David's house, in the words that we had earlier in chapter 7 of Shmuel Bet, when God promises David kingship. And here we have the fulfillment of that promise. This is the second ending to the book. This is where the kingship is actually established. But it's put in the book of Kings. It's established through manipulation. It's established through politics. It's not clear that what Natan says is true, actually. It's not clear that David took an oath. It's not clear how much David knew. All of that is very unclear. And it will get worse in terms of the behavior, because we know that Natan, and Bathsheba pretty much said it herself, but Natan says, listen, if he's the king, your life expectancy is going to drop very quickly, and your son. Because when it comes to kingship, rivalry for kingship, kings often will eliminate the competition. And that's going to happen, actually, in the story. So it's a very dark story. The story of Abraham with the servant, with Rivka, is all a very beautiful story. It's all about people choosing to do the right thing. Rivka will decide to leave, to come. It's her decision. And Avram sets instructions out. But at the end of the day, Rivka will come. It's all consensual. And she will decide to be the matriarch. It's a beautiful story. Story over here has many dark sides to it. But in any event, that's what Bathsheba says over here. And now it's just a couple more verses, and then I'll stop and for comments, questions, comments, and just say a couple of words at the end. So V'yom HaMelech David, Kimuli with Tzadok HaKohen, U'Natan HaNavi, V'Livnayahu ben Yehoyada. So David calls those three people that Natan had mentioned, the army man, the priest, and the prophet, and he instructs them. He says to them in the 33rd verse to put Shlomo on the mule. Presumably, the mule is a royal animal. Again, reminds us very much putting him on the mule to determine kingship, of hiring the people to run before him. It's very much reminds us of the Megillah as well, where Mordechai is paraded through the town on the sus, and that already prefigures the idea that Mordechai will be the one that the king is going to promote, and that Haman, who has to lead him through the streets, is the one the king plans to demote and actually to eliminate completely. So we have another Megillah reference over here, and David continues. Umbashach or Tosham, he is to be anointed with the oil, which is another sign of kingship. Adoniah doesn't have the anointer. That's what Shlomo's going to have. And Natan HaNavi is there as well. Utchatem b'shofar v'amartem yichi hamelech Shlomo. Sound the shofar and announce, long live King Solomon. V'avitem acharav uba v'yashav al kisi v'hu yimloch tachtai v'yotot tziviti v'yot nagid al Yisrael v'yal Yehuda, and then bring him, have him sit on my throne. He sits on his father's seat. So David gives the instructions not just to choose Shlomo, not just to announce it publicly, not just to anoint him with the oil, not just to have the prophet there as well, but he actually sits on my throne while I am alive. So next week we will continue with this theme and see how this all plays out. It's very interesting about how this all works, how Shlomo will assume the kingship, and what happens afterwards in terms of ensuring that Shlomo becomes the king. It's not the prettiest of stories, but that's how the kingship is established. And this is the second ending to the book about kingship. The first is the ideal king, and the second is, from a practical standpoint, this political institution that we call kingship, which has many dark pieces to it. How does it get established? Didn't want to say one or two words. Anybody have something to comment about anything that's been said this morning? Yes, Ruth.
I have a question. Well, first of all, when Bathsheba added an ingredient that Natan had not mentioned, when she told David about the oath that he had taken, she inserted that you swore by Hashem, which is something that Natan did not tell her to say. And that gave me a little echo of Chava adding a little piece to what she had been told she was forbidden to do. But more disturbing to me is the fact that David mentions it when he takes the new oath, and can't that be considered a conditional? He says, "As I swore the last time, so I'm swearing now."
Right. So that was the point that I was trying to make, and thank you for repeating that. I mentioned that. Right, I mentioned that was a little problematic. I swear to you now to fulfill the oath that I once took, but it's not clear that he actually took that oath. Now, you could argue that in biblical oaths, it doesn't always matter. In other words, they swear not to kill the Givonim who say they come from a faraway land. Turns out that they came from next door, but the oath still seems to be binding. So biblical oaths seem to have a power, even if they're taken to some extent, not with the full knowledge or based on some kind of error, they do seem to have a force. So in this case, we don't know whether he took that oath or not, actually. That's one of the questions that hangs over the whole kingship. And I think
But that can't invalidate the new oath? That's what I'm concerned about.
I'm saying that's the question. I don't think that necessarily it invalidates. In our modern thinking, something is done with that mistakenly, it's not valid. But it doesn't sound that way in the Bible. It sounds that even if an oath were taken, even though it were taken based on misinformation, it does sound like in the Tanakh that oath could be valid, but the point you're making is very important in the sense that I think that the book, unlike, say, Divrei Hayamim, is sort of a cloud which hangs over the kingship. It's clear to me that David doesn't necessarily, sounds like David doesn't actually choose Shlomo. David has to be forced into, be reminded of an oath maybe he took or didn't take, but he certainly doesn't come forward and says, this is my successor. That's only the insistence both of Bathsheba and of Natan. So that's something which is very interesting, that Shlomo in the book of Kings, there's a cloud that hangs over him. Actually, there are actually many clouds that hang over him. Okay, I did want to just say, again, so we'll continue next week with the story. Thank you for the comment. Everybody's welcome to speak up. In general, I would like that. Yes? Someone else? No. Okay. Let me just conclude now with, I was thinking a lot about the, well, of course, we're all thinking about the current situation, the virus, and many thoughts about that. But two things came to mind, actually. One is that the Megillah, which to me is very much the world in which we live, living with these uncertainties. What the Megillah strikes me is, what's striking the Megillah is the danger, extreme danger. And danger is Amalek, basically, who is the enemy of the Jews, but the enemy of the world. Amalek is the enemy of the man and the woman, of Adam and Eve, God's enemy. And that Amalek is very dangerous, comes very close to destroying the Jews. That night, the king couldn't sleep. And that there's a great vulnerability when you, which we often don't think about. We live in a very uncertain and a very vulnerable world. And that's something to reflect upon, and that the vulnerabilities and the uncertainties, which are very frightening, in the Megillah also bring out the best in people. I mean, Esther is the great heroine. She rises to the occasion. She deals with the uncertainty. She's willing to make the sacrifice. And sometimes a very dangerous situation can bring out the best in us, and I hope that it does for all of us. But the other part of it is, it strikes me that thinking about seeing ourselves in terms of being part of humanity, you know, in terms of, one is Purim and one is Yom HaKippurim. I was thinking about some of the prayers of Yom Kippur, the Sana Tokef, which is not about being Jewish per se. It's about the world. It's about being a human being. And Adam Yesodom Meyafar, the power of the Sana Tokef is that we live in God's world. We are human beings. We're connected to humanity. And we all have so much in common. We have a lot more in common than we have not in common. We're all frail and mortal, and often don't know what the right thing is that we should be doing. And I think a situation like this allows us to reflect upon very deep truths about ourselves, how we're connected to the whole world, and not just our own little, to step out of our own narrow spaces and to think of ourselves in much different terms than we often do. I think that's very important as well. So we're in this together. Hopefully we can prevail. Brings out, I think, potentially allows us to reflect deeply upon who we are, and hopefully will allow us to and impel us to think about what we can do in this crisis, each in our own way, to help our communities and to help the whole world, to be part of a response and a positive response to a very difficult situation. I am very grateful, at least with the opportunity, with the technology, at least in this sense. It's not the same as being together, but to be able to, with all of you. So we'll meet again next week, and we pray for better times. Thank you.